debt, where it's even possible that money is actually not an obligation, which always is a debt. An obligation translates to a debt. If paper money is issued that's redeemable in gold, the gold is a debt for the paper. But as I explained in my story, not only in our show a week ago, but in the interview that Patty Walking Turtle did, and I can elaborate on further, there's no such thing as a money which is not an obligation unless you relieve it of obligation, which means that it can be turned into anything, because it's obligation which fixes its value, and obligation only. In the case of mathematically perfected economy, the very property that's represented is what the currency is redeemable in, and the obligation is to pay that much exactly out of circulation. And that obligation forces the real creditor who accepts the promissory note for the property that he gives up. They have an interest then in maintaining the value of the circulation, whereas alike and of the basic proportions, of what we consider to be the value of the represented property. Both the debtor, who is the issuer of a promissory obligation, and the real creditor who accepts the promissory obligation are both interested in maintenance of the value of the money and property. And you can only do this if you maintain this perpetual, not only if you only maintain this perpetual one-to-one relationship between remaining value of the property, remaining circulation, and remaining obligation, but likewise if you eradicate this thing that I call maldisposition. That is, as artificial indebtedness is multiplied in proportion to a circulation by interest, ever more of the circulation is dedicated to servicing debt, making it unavailable to sustain the industry, which is obligated to do so, that is, to service the debt. So maldisposition, as eventually all of every unit of circulation is dedicated to servicing artificial indebtedness, it eventually entirely destroys our ability to sustain industry. So we need to understand this. Now, this idea that money can't be a debt, that it can be spent into circulation, as Ellen Hodgson Brown and Bill Stills have been advocating in the piece I played last week, is something that I want to take up there where we left off last week, because this is something we really have to get right. Now, where does this idea come from? As I said, Jay Coran had written me, and next thing you know, he's plagiarized my Parable of Perfect Economy on the first page of his book, an event that didn't even happen, that, as I explained, I'd been notified by academia this event didn't even happen, and although parts of it had been told to me originally in a story by a lecturer, they called me out on it, and I had to admit that, I'd been looking for, documentation of this, since I first heard it, lost contact with this man, and it didn't exist. So I turned it into a parable. Thereafter, taking extensive, literary license to revise it to an even better story to explain mathematically perfected economy. So we have to understand this point that I made last week about what is a solution, which is embedded in this story. That is, I left a fault, and as I told you, I challenged Ellen Hodgson Brown to explain how this currency wasn't inflationary. And the reason that I did so is the very thing that I did in this story was leave a fault in there that it would be inflationary. And then I would tell the story, usually verbally, for many years before I ever published it in 1979. And when I would tell it, the person would be flabbergasted. The audience, however many people I would be telling it to, they would be flabbergasted, because I had just demonstrated how you could fund government without taxation. None. No taxation, you see. And I explain this in a positive way in this story, and it's a phenomenal thing to apprehend when you see that this principle indeed could be applied to anything and everything. So I was wondering, because when Jay Curran's book came out, I noticed all these people are asking, and advocate me about, the nature of money, because they wanted to justify this idea that it could be spent into circulation. And suddenly I realized that because this coincided with Jay Curran's book, that in fact my story of my parable of perfect economy was the reason for all the confusion. Well, actually, it wouldn't have been in its original form, but Jay Curran should have understood that, because I explained these things in the beginning of the story before. Now, the problem is that evidently that went right over the top of his head. Then after he plagiarized me, and other people did too. There was people up in Canada, this Bank of Canada thing. They were trying to say that the Bank of Canada had been established for this very purpose, and they were trying to restore that. And the truth is, the Bank of Canada wasn't an exhaustive proof of such a thing, especially as serves it, because in fact it's false. Number one, I put it in there false on purpose. But nevertheless, now there's a tremendous number of people that are insisting that money cannot be a debt. The people who have read the plagiarists of my own work are coming at me and insisting that they know more than I do, that money cannot be a debt. And yet, none of them can explain how, and I would like to invalidate the reasons that they might give by telling this story, in which we'll all get up to speed on, what is this parable of perfect economy? How did these people get this idea that money can't be a debt, so that we can dispel it? We have to understand what won't work, cannot work. And although this is a grand idea, and once you hear it, you will want to retain this. And the fact that I've told you we can't do this, you're going to be very disappointed in. But at the same time, when I explain the right way to do this, it's of no further cost. It's simply the only thing that you can do if you want a money with integrity, you see. You can't just spend this into circulation. Moreover, actual mathematically perfected economy, merely by its obligatory schedule of payment, takes care of all these issues without any kind of necessary government administration. And this is a thing that we all have to appreciate too. We have to realize that we have to restore government back to its minimal form, where it can't harm us any longer. Government does very, very, very little, actually, for us. It gets us into more trouble than we'd ever really want to have anything to do with if we were ourselves of right mind. But in any case, let's just read this parable of perfect economy. It's a short story. And then afterward, I'll discuss the issues and where you will see, if you pay close attention, you will see where this idea that money could be spent into circulation comes from. It comes from this story. And I made this part up only to tell the listener afterward, now what is wrong with that? Because I had explained mathematically perfected economy. I was testing them. I was testing them to see if they were really following carefully, so that if they were a really smart person, they would tell me what was wrong. Very few ever did. Okay, and they would look at me quizzically in the other case, and they would wonder, what? I never heard such a perfect thing. What could possibly be wrong with that? They were incredulous that I would say that this is wrong. We can't do that. But then I would explain why we can't do it and how to fix it, and it's a very simple matter. But here's where the idea comes from. Amongst the injustices leading to the American Revolution, Benjamin Franklin was sent to England in part to demand a relaxation of taxes. While the colonists' prosperity fell under the recent injustices, they had already become prominent manufacturers and traders. They were skillful and innovative shipbuilders, and now the vessels they had built even enabled them to become equally skillful evaders of the many excessive duties levied upon them without the familiar requisite they were about to demand, representation. Presently they rose, perhaps as no colony had before, to demand a return toward justice. Franklin was a renowned author, publisher, scientist, philosopher, and statesman, and there was tremendous anticipation of his arrival in the mother country. The subjects of each environment grew in opposite directions. The colonists expected independence. Their English cousins and their ruling class expected subjugation. In England, the little news from the colonies was passed largely by disreputable sailors in equally disreputable places, that is, bars. Little was believed of these tales, and so it was largely assumed that Franklin's reputation was exaggerated. It was anticipated that his visit would prove him relatively uncultured, a woodsman hardly fit to duly represent his peers amongst English dignitaries. The encounter, however, would soon prove him far ahead of their time. His answers to their questions would change the world. As I present this, you can understand, I'm going to tell you about some further research that I completed this morning, and there was, when I wrote these things, the latest versions of them and validated research, there was almost nobody interested in this material, and now there's 25 million documents on the internet about this, and this is yet just my story. So as I said, the encounter, however, would soon prove him far ahead of their time. His answers to their questions would change the world. Upon his arrival, Franklin was swept to a prominent engagement. There, before the ruling class of England, the guest of honor was soon compelled to make a speech. Amidst considerable ado, Franklin walked slowly to the podium, adjusted the curious spectacles the woodsman had invented, and surveyed his audience attentively. Thinking undecidedly what to speak about, instead he thought it better to ask them, "What's your pleasure?" They, of course, beseeched him to tell about the colonies. He knew well of their affairs, and particularly that even prominent lawyers spent a good part of the year behind on their rent, that they often went hungry, that few non-aristocrats owned property, that many suffered from poor diet, that common citizens spent their lives hoping to pay imposing debt. The British people were largely ever hopeful of meaningful employment and in constant dire need. He was naturally inclined, therefore, to convey the relative state of the colonies. And so he began his answer with what in retrospect is readily understood to be a remarkable report. He began saying, "You can leave your ship with just your baggage, walk beyond the furthest homestead, and become an immediate landowner." Such disbelief arose upon his first sentence that Franklin was forced to stop. England's upper class loudly refused to believe him. Franklin nonetheless simply waited for quiet, and when he could, he continued without responding otherwise to the interruption. He thus spoke slowly and perhaps even somewhat defiantly, saying, Furthermore, the forests are vast, and you can cut down all the trees you can imagine and build whatever kind of home you please.